Hello students, thank you for joining me for Walking with Christ through realist literature. The great realist writers from Charles Dickens to Leo Tolstoy, Fyodor Dostoevsky and Gustave Flaubert were interested in telling a larger story, and they were learning from Jesus, sometimes explicitly in their writing, as he too was catching us up in a larger story, a deeper reality that it's often hard to see in the busyness and the half-truths that entangle us in our world. The great realist writers often get at that deeper truth, that more full reality, by giving us a cross-section of perspectives. In a good realist novel, you often see many characters ranging from the people at the bottom of society, the scullery maids and street urchins, all the way up through the middle classes to the aristocracy. And seeing all of these different perspectives, these different characters with their goals and desires and friction with each other, helps us to see the truths, the deeper reality that each of them individually finds it hard to see. And so, in a very similar way, if we look at Jesus' teachings, we can see in a lot of his parables, he would use a similar technique. Think of the story of the Pharisee and the tax collector praying at the temple, that Jesus uses to give us a more realistic view of what righteousness really means. Or the story of the prodigal son, where the competing perspectives of the first and the second-born sons with the father give us a fleshed out view of the reality, the nuance of grace and belonging. Or think of Jesus' story of the rich man and Lazarus, that helps us see the deeper truth of righteousness and what it means to lead a successful life. It's on that last point that Jesus' realism throughout his ministry cuts very deeply for us. And we see this same point in Tolstoy's story, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, that we read in this module. Beware of succeeding at the wrong things, because in many ways we could come to the end of our life and find that the whole world around us has been wrapped up in pursuits that really don't matter. Or as Tolstoy has Ivan realize, in some ways it seems like the whole world has been conspiring to hide from us the things that really do matter. What if many of the pursuits we're led to follow, education, career, success, even romantic love and relationship, many of these things are just defense mechanisms holding off our fear of death and our own soul sickness? What if the whole world just chases from one empty pursuit after another, trying to distract themselves from facing the thing that cannot be escaped, their own mortality, and the small window of time that we have as a gift to live in this world with whatever intelligence and ability that God has given us, to be a blessing, not to live in selfishness for our own success or pride or fortune or pleasure, but to live in a way that our choices in the short time we have do God's work in the world. It's that kind of a reality that Jesus is pointing to when he starts his ministry announcing the coming of the kingdom of God. He says, get ready because God's kingdom is on the way. It's close, and in fact, it's already here. It looks like other forces rule our world, that the world is run by wealth or politics or prestige, but actually right now God is in charge. And when God's way is made clear, many of these things that don't matter will be blasted to pieces and blown away. So get ready. The kingdom of God is at hand. And if we are Christians, we should take that warning to heart and be very careful that we don't invest ourselves too deeply in things that ultimately will not matter in the end. What does matter? What is the right way to live? The realists ask us this question again and again, and we do well to consider it ourselves. And here again we find that Jesus' teaching cuts even deeper, because if we're really going to follow Christ, it's not only a matter of figuring out how to invest in the things that matter, but we also have to realize that part of Christ's calling is to a life of self-sacrifice. That following Christ does not exempt us from struggle and difficulty, but that for Jesus himself, doing the will of God and establishing the kingdom of God through his life meant being willing to be misunderstood and rejected, and even to be tortured and crucified. What some writers have called the stark realism of the cross cuts through, explodes, reverses so much of the romantic delusions of the world around us. And if we are going to be realistic about the truth of God's kingdom, we have to come to terms with carrying the cross after Jesus in our own lives. Think about the moments in Jesus' teaching where he said things like, "A student is not above his teacher. If the world rejects the teacher, if they crucify our leader, how would we expect that we would get treatment that's any different? It's enough for us to become like our teacher." And whether that cross is going to come in sickness or death, unexpected, or through a long, gradual decline in life, we know that we're only temporarily able-bodied. Whether we're going to have years of pleasure and fulfillment and then some sudden, difficult challenge to face, or whether God has called us to a constant and simple way that we must pour ourselves out in small daily actions serving others, a kind of a daily sacrifice that is our act of worship. Whatever the form the cross takes in our lives, we know that if we are Christians, this is what we've signed on for. Not a life of pleasure, not an exemption from difficulty, but for us to be part of the struggle that all the rest of humanity is part of. The suffering, ultimately the dying that everyone experiences. But as Christians, we choose to go through those difficulties to let our suffering be part of God's blessing to the world around us. How to do that is very difficult. But if we can have that perspective, that kind of Christ-centered realism about our lives, it makes our discipleship to Jesus deeply meaningful and fruitful. It means we're part of a bigger story that goes beyond ourselves. We don't have to worry when we have hit the end of our own abilities, when we go through dark times, pandemic, or academic struggle, even the collapse of a relationship or a career. These things take their place in a greater story that is more beautiful even for the darkness that gives contrast and contour to the grace and the love and the joy that is the deep reality of God's world. I'd like to end by quoting another realist writer, George Eliot, who says in Adam Bede, "It's a good thing that many of us are not as ideally beautiful, intelligent, or successful as we would like to be. Because if we were, we would only turn a colder eye on our neighbors, the real, often foolish, fairly ugly and stupid people with whom we have to make a life. And we do find meaning and beauty in our world, don't we? We find things that are lovable in the people that we actually have to live with. Love is like the mighty rivers that bless the earth," Eliot writes. "It rolls with a resistless force and brings beauty with it." In another of her books, Middlemarch, she ends the novel having told the story of someone about your age that started out adult life full of passion and idealism, wanting to change the world. And after many adventures and relationships, comes to a later point in life where it seems like she hasn't done much worthwhile. The people around her think her decisions have been strange, that she hasn't lived up to the potential that she seems to have as a young student. And yet the narrator says, Our lives have been blessed by people like Dorothea. Not that they did some great world-changing act, but that in small ways their daily acts of service and love to their neighbors have been part of the river that waters our world. Our lives have been blessed by these small acts of love of those who now rest in unremembered graves.